Don't you have to take your daughter? Or?
My son did it.
Oh, okay. All right. Good morning. Let's begin. So last week we looked at the story of the woman caught in adultery at the beginning of John chapter 8. And we want to continue in chapter 8, but especially we want to look today in chapter 9, where Jesus heals a man born blind, and what the theological implications are of that discussion and that event. But first, in chapter 8, we continue this theme where Jesus calls himself the light of the world. Jesus spoke to them again, "I'm the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life." A couple of weeks ago, when we saw that Jesus had arrived in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles or Festival of Tabernacles or Festival of Booths, we talked about how there were a couple of ceremonies that occur during that week-long, 8-day festival. And one of them was the water ceremony. And back in chapter 7, Jesus talked about himself as the living water. So in the middle of this Jewish festival, he was proclaiming that something greater has arrived. The water ceremony was when the priests went over to the pool of Siloam, and the high priest got some water, and the priests and Levites had a little processional back to the temple, and they prayed and gave thanks. But Jesus said, "I'm a living water. Those who partake of this water never get thirsty again." So he's saying that there's a spiritual water. There's something better than their ceremony. But another one of their ceremonies was the light ceremony, where they put lights, I guess they would be lantern-type lights. They didn't have electric lights. They illuminated all the outside of the temple. And everyone came around to see the ceremony of light. But Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world, and just like those who partake of the living water never get thirsty again, those who partake of him, the light of the world, will never be in darkness again." So once again, Jesus is proclaiming himself greater than their old festivals. Something new has arrived that's going to be better than the festivals they know. And this is one of John's emphases. And this is one of the things that makes John different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were centered very much on the Galilean ministry of Jesus. Because in order to talk about Jesus in relation to the Jewish festivals, you've got to talk about the trips that Jesus made down to Jerusalem. Now, we don't record all of those trips because as a faithful Jew, Jesus, in 3.5 years of ministry, no doubt went to Jerusalem multiple times. 3 times a year was actually quite normal for 3 different festivals. But we see a few of them in John because there's a theological point that Jesus makes at some of them. And Jesus engages in some deeper theological discussion at some of these festivals. Now, these theological discussions where you get into abstract statements and statements that are hard for the crowd to understand at first, like, I'm a living water and you'll never thirst again, I'm the light of the world. These are the kind of statements that wouldn't necessarily be a great choice for a preacher like Peter, preaching in Rome to Gentiles with no Jewish festival background whatsoever. And that's what we believe the Gospel of Mark is Mark recording Peter's preaching to Gentiles in Rome. And so it was natural for Peter to omit some of the heavily Jewish aspects of Jesus' teaching. And also, what do you do when you're preaching to people who have no Bible background and don't know the basics yet of the gospel? You teach them the basics of the gospel. You don't teach them the more difficult passages and the deeper theological ideas. You start out with the basics of the gospel. That's what we find in Mark, and we find John writing, saying, you know what, there were some very deep things that we didn't understand at the time, and they're not recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so I'm going to record them. That's what the Gospel of John is largely about. Now that Jesus has conflict in Jerusalem because of this teaching. And we won't read all of the chapter, but the crowd starts saying things like, you're speaking about yourself. You're testifying about yourself. And Jesus replies, no, it's not just me who testifies. The Father also testifies for me. And he testifies through the signs, the miracles. John refers to Jesus' miracles always as signs because he's emphasizing the theological function of the miracles. They were to serve as signs to get people's attention to the message. In addition to accomplishing a healing or something right on the spot, they were signs to say, this is not just another man. This is not just another teacher or rabbi. This is the Messiah. This was a man sent from the Father. And so these signs testify to Jesus. But then the crowd takes offense that he says things like he and the Father are one, and he only teaches what the Father sent him to teach. Who are you to elevate yourself like that? So this is a source of conflict, that he makes himself equal to the Father. And eventually he even says, in one of his famous divinity claims, just beginning in verse 50 of John chapter 8, I do not seek my glory, the one who seeks it also judges. That would be the Father. I assure you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death ever. So now he's gone beyond, the implications of you'll never get thirsty again if you partake of this living water. You'll never be in darkness again because I'm the light of the world. If you follow me, you'll never be in darkness. And now he says, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death ever. Then the Jews said, now we know you have a demon. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. You say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death ever. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? Even the prophets died. Who do you pretend to be? If I glorify myself, Jesus answered, my glory is nothing. My Father, you say about him, he is our God. He is the one who glorifies me. You've never known him, but I know him. If I were to say I don't know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father, Abraham, was overjoyed that he would see my day. He saw it and rejoiced. The Jews replied, "You aren't 50 years old yet, and you've seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "I assure you, before Abraham was, I am." Now that phrase, "I am," when God had never revealed a name to his followers until Moses asked him at the burning bush, "Who shall I say spoke to me from the bush?" And God identified himself, "Tell them, I am," or "I am who I am," which is a name that implies God has always been and always will be. He is the essence of being. He doesn't have a starting point and an ending point. I am eternally. And Jesus uses that phrase here, before Abraham was, I am. Not I was. So they understand the implications. He's claiming to be God. He's claiming to be equal to their Father. And at that they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden and went out of the temple complex. It wasn't his time to die yet. His time hadn't come, and he was miraculously saved from this crowd. But we notice something here, which is that Jesus made some very indirect claims of his divinity throughout his 3.5-year ministry. But now we're at about 6 months before the crucifixion. We're about 3 years into the ministry. And this is his final festival of the tabernacles in Jerusalem. 6 months from now, he's going to go through the final Passover where he's crucified and died. It's not time for him yet, but he is getting very provocative in his statements. Now that the last few months of his life have arrived, he's saying things that are going to lead to his death, even though he doesn't want that death to come immediately. He's saying things that will cause the Jewish leaders to be lying in wait for him to come back to Jerusalem so that they can grab him. And so this is a shift in tone. You see, he's ramping things up towards the end of his ministry in the things that he says about himself. And that brings us to chapter 9, the healing of a man born blind. We'll read the first 12 verses. As he was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples questioned him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus answered. "This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So he repeats, "I am the light of the world," but it's in context of a man who's in darkness. He's blind. After he said these things, he spit on the ground, made some mud from the saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. His neighbors and those who formerly had seen him as a beggar said, "Isn't this the man who sat begging?" Some said, "He's the one." "No," others were saying, "but he looks like him." And he kept saying, "I am the one." Therefore they asked him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So when I went and washed, I received my sight." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he said. One interesting thing about this story is that the man born blind didn't come to Jesus seeking healing. Jesus went and found him. I think Jesus, as part of his declaration that he's the light of the world, wanted to find this man and heal him to make that point. I conquer darkness. Now, the Jews had a belief that sin must be the reason for any severe medical condition you could have, like blindness and a lot of others. So that left them with a real puzzle here. Is this man born blind because of his own sin? Well, that's a problem, because that means we're saying he sinned before he was ever born. On the other hand, was he born blind because of his parents' sin? Is it like punishing the parents by having him be born blind? Well, there's problems with that. Basic problems of justice and fairness come to mind. Why not punish the parents directly and leave the baby out of it, So this was a big problem for them. They had two explanations, and neither one of them was a good explanation, and that's why his disciples, Jesus' own disciples, said, "Which of these two is it?" And Jesus says, this blindness was permitted to show God's power. But we have to face something deeper here. That explanation by Jesus applies to this one case. What about somebody who lives 200 miles away from Jerusalem and never comes into contact with Jesus and doesn't get healed, and he was born blind? What's the explanation for that? This is a special case. They asked him, this man, why was this man born blind? And Jesus answered why this man was born blind. But human suffering is a much bigger issue than this one man. We have to dig a little deeper. Is sin the cause of suffering? Well, the first two possibilities Jesus rules out. He's not born blind because of his own sin. He's not born blind because of his parents' sin. But think about this. If the entire human race were sinless, and if the world were one great big global Garden of Eden, do you think someone would be born blind? That's not my picture of what Eden was. Right? So, no, it's not the man's sin. No, it's not the parent's sin. But we would be protected against terrible things like this if there were no such thing as sin, if they're all Eden. So in a sense, it is sin that's related, but it wasn't his particular sin. Someone who's born blind or deaf or whatever, it is in fact related to sin. It's just not particular sin. We aren't protected from that kind of terrible condition because collectively we are sinners. Collectively we are outcasts from Eden. And so it has something to do with sin, but it doesn't have to do with just one person's guilt. Is that fair? Is it fair for someone to suffer because other people sinned? Well, we have to face the facts. There's no question we do suffer because of what other people do. We suffer in this world, this life. If you're the victim of violent crime, theft, adultery, if you're caught up in a war, you suffer from someone else's sin. That's a fact. We can't dodge that. Fair or not, that's the way a world that has sin in it, a world that is not Eden, functions. Yes, we do suffer because of other people's sins. But we don't suffer eternally. I'm not judged for someone else's sin. I don't suffer eternally because someone else sinned. That would be unjust. So that leads to a question. If my sin is part of the collective sin, is part of the reason we don't live in an Eden. What should be my attitude when I see that these parents over here have a child who was born with some terrible medical condition? For most of my life, I would have kind of a detached attitude. I hope they can cope with it. That's really too bad. But can we be detached from other people's suffering? We're kind of all in this together. If I see someone and their child was born with some medical problem, it's not the fault of the child in particular. It's not the fault of the parents in particular. It's not the fault of me in particular. But I'm as much a part of the problem as the parents or anybody else through sin. So I can't be detached from other people's suffering because I'm part of it. And we talked a couple of weeks ago, or we talked last week when we talked about the woman caught in adultery and how the Jews were made aware of their collective responsibility for their situation. The dilemma they faced was because of their own collective guilt as a nation. That's why they had Gentiles ruling over that. It all went back to the captivity in Babylon. So they were responsible collectively, and they accepted that there was such a thing as collective responsibility. And you can't avoid being affected by what goes on around you. I used the example, the Babylonian captivity. A lot of good people got carried off into captivity, like Daniel and his young friends. Right? They were righteous ones. They were carried off into captivity. You don't escape what's happening to everyone around you in this life. If the nation is suffering because of its sin, everybody in the nation suffers, even the good ones. And that should lead to a collective responsibility. Maybe if you live in ancient Israel and you see other people engaging in idolatry and you hear the prophets warning what's coming if you don't stop, maybe you can't just isolate yourself and say, well, I'm not doing it. Maybe you have to speak up to your neighbors because you're going to get caught up in the consequences of what they're doing. Maybe you can't just be detached from everyone else in the world and take no responsibility. It's their responsibility. It's what they're doing. People don't live as islands, and that's something that we are responsible for. And if we see suffering, we're responsible to reach out. Sure. Right. 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 Well, there are passages that talk about how the captivities and the punishments of God upon the nation as a whole were because of, quote, the sins of the fathers. But I don't think that means your father, like it's just your family or something. In other words, the sins of your ancestors. Yeah. They're thinking, so it is possible, to have that kind of collective punishment. But this is a little different. As opposed to the whole nation suffering in captivity because of the sins of a previous generation who was in idolatry, it's this particular person is born blind. And that becomes a little thornier. Yeah, we all have these sins. As a nation, we've all sinned. So why does this person get born blind and not this person? It's still a problem to deal with. So it's not that easy for them to understand, I think. But yes, there are passages when talking about suffering in this life, not eternally, that talk about that. Now, I believe it's Ezekiel chapter 18. The whole chapter is about eternal punishment, who will die, eternally, and it's for your own sins, not your father's sin. So stop blaming it on them, and so on. But then there are other passages that if you take them out of context would seem to contradict that, because they're talking about this world punishment and this world consequences. And yeah, you can suffer this world consequences because of your ancestors even, who aren't even around anymore. And isn't that true in this world right now? Yeah. Yeah. With Achan and right. 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 And they were applying it beyond just suffering. And in fact, Ezekiel, I think chapter 18 begins with, you will not use that proverb anymore. I don't want to hear it anymore, God says, basically, because people are blaming their spiritual punishment on others. Yeah. So there is something in this world that goes on that seems very unfair. You suffer because of other people. But there's no escaping that. All you can do, first of all, is take collective responsibility, like the people who should speak up when their neighbors are in idolatry or something. Because when they didn't speak up and it went on, they all got carried off in captivity. But also, this kind of human suffering, this man born blind, don't just say, well, tough luck for him and his parents and so on. Take some responsibility there too. Now, what's the aftermath of this healing? Well, they bring the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees, and they question him, and he just describes what happened. And then they start making a big deal again out of, oh, it was on the Sabbath day. And we've been through that before, that defining a healing as work and claiming you can't do that on the Sabbath was part of their legalism. And they didn't get satisfaction talking to the man, so they called his parents in. What's going on here? Well, his parents perceived they could be on the wrong side of the Jewish leaders, be cast out of the synagogue and so on. So his parents said, he's a grown man, ask him. They didn't want to take the brunt of the questioning. So they called the man back in. The man comes back in, and he's very bold. He's a lot bolder than his parents, because you can imagine he's the one filled of gratitude. He's the one who got healed. So he's willing to be bold. And after the leaders say, we know God spoke to Moses, but this man, we don't even know where he's from. The man who was born blind replied, this is an amazing thing. The man told them, you don't know where he's from, but he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. But if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. Think about it, that's no doubt true. We don't have any miracles like that. If you're born blind and you decades later as an adult, there weren't any cases of somebody being healed. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Now, he's saying something very true. God isn't going to work through anyone but someone like a Messiah or a prophet to accomplish great things like this, because if he did, he would be validating that bad man. You know, if God works a miracle through Jesus, God's validated. The Father is validating the Son. The Father is lifting up the Son in the eyes of everyone who sees the miracle. But he's not going to do that if Jesus is this terrible sinner that these Jewish leaders claim he is. And then in verse 34, the response of the Jewish leaders. You were born entirely in sin, they replied, and you're trying to teach us? Then they threw him out. You were born entirely in sin. In other words, going back to the original question from the disciples, his blindness has to be direct sin related. It's got to be that him or his parents or both or something. And so you're born entirely in sin. So, don't try to correct us. And this all ties back, I think, to the light ceremony. Jesus saying, I'm the light of the world. Those who follow me will never be in darkness again. Jesus sought out a blind man and healed him. The blind man wasn't seeking him. Jesus sought him out and healed him, I think, as part of his demonstration of what it means to be the spiritual light of the world. He stands above all darkness, including blindness. And then he uses that phrase to say that they're blind. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do see will become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and asked him, we aren't blind too, are we? Jesus told them, if you were blind, you wouldn't have sin. In other words, they wouldn't be responsible for not seeing if they were blind. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. When you claim to have vision, and of course he really means spiritual vision, then you're responsible for your blindness. If you're proud and say, I see everything spiritually, then whatever you're blind to, that compounds your sin. So Jesus is trying to talk about spiritual sight, spiritual light, spiritual darkness, spiritual blindness. They don't quite get it all. But this kind of fits in with John's theme of Jesus rising above the existing Jewish festivals. So we'll continue in chapter 10 next week. Thank you.